As a bit of a bold move, I actually managed to learn extremely little about the way Civilization 7 mechanically plays prior to getting my hands on it. Now, I was interested in the development of it, but I wanted to experience the game as it came to me. So while I can't say I went in blind, I do think I've got an experience closer to series veteran who just picked the game up than someone following every dev diary and what have you. A little about my experience with the series to get you familiar with me so you can measure if you think I've got an earned opinion. I started with Civilization 3 as a semi-literate child and didn't know what shields even did for most of my time playing it, but I remember having to build roads to resources. I played a lot of 4 and its side release of colonization, and the Celt theme is burned into my brain for life. 5 was and still is the biggest one for me, and it had a lot of departures from the series that were, at the time, controversial, but I liked them. I enjoyed the graphic style, I liked that civs had unique abilities, I liked that doom stacks were gone, the hex system felt good, but I remembered being sad that my silly strategies of found every religion were no longer an option. Civ 6 is tough. I've written and unwritten a half dozen rough drafts on my thoughts on it, sometimes more angry and ranty, and other times more about the positives. I think my ideal game would be Civ 5 but with districts, if I'm being honest. Okay, so now on to Civ 7. On the whole, there's 2 themes you'll see repeating for a lot of sections. First, there are some big changes to the series in this game, and that will cause growing pains. Second, there's a delicate balance to be had between iterating and newness and allowing this more open-ended, customizable experience with builds against keeping true to audience expectations of what a Civ game should be. There's something to keeping familiar elements that worked, or some that kinda didn't, that people are hesitant to let go of. My personal conclusion is that it's fresh and interesting, and interestingly, despite having a very strong first game, it wasn't until I started my second one that I felt grounded and like I knew what to be excited for. The perennial meme of, ugh, insert new Civ sucks, why can't we go back to previous entry, will live on with this entry to the series, not because it's bad, but because it changes a lot of the systems at once, perhaps more than any other Civ. But at the same time, it changes them in familiar ways. I'll table that thought for this video, but the changes will make an appearance when relevant. By the way, none of this is euphemistic for saying it's not enjoyable. The game is fun in its own right, but I earnestly do feel like a lot has changed at once, and some of it comes with great new ideas I can see the vision of, and some of it steps away from the Civ formula, if such a thing truly exists. With that said, let's get into looking at the game, though I will save more in-depth thoughts for a future video. This is about what struck me my first time through. In fact, let's start with the menu. Exciting, I know. Perhaps an odd thing to start with, but it is the first thing that immediately caught my notice. They've not embraced the future that is nested tooltips. To be clear, they do exist in-game in an extremely limited capacity. Like, it took hours for me to notice one, but it was instant that I saw words in bold that I tried to click on but couldn't. But since the game is capable of nesting, as I later learned, the use of nesting can definitely be changed, implemented more broadly. Along with that, you cannot access the Civilopedia from outside a game. Given that this was one of my most persistent frustrations with 6, it was something I looked for pretty immediately, and it frustrates me now. There's a clear focus on conveying information to players. The tutorial, which is toggleable, wants to make sure you know how to play the game. The game wants to be understood, to an extent. Focus is one thing, execution is another. The intent of teaching players is dampened by the UI hurdles of no nested tooltips and no menu Civilopedia. Given the game's drastic changes, a bit of guidance is helpful, so I appreciate the tutorial, but I wish the complete package was there. The leader and Civ selection screen communicates most of what you need, but I feel like having the pedia on hand would help me plan a little more, or just, get excited about learning about new history and leaders and concepts the game is exposing me to. I don't know a ton about the Aksumite Empire beyond where they were geographically, and playing as them does throw bits of info at you, but it feels like the history is harder to reach than in previous games, which is a shame because they put more effort into the history. Now into the game itself. There are some things that didn't make a strong impression in a good way, like moving units and combat. It felt familiar and fine and like what I expected. Combat itself is pretty straightforward, but not in a way where it feels lacking. The big change is commanders, and unlike some changes we'll get to, it's more an addition than a change outright, unlikely to be controversial. Commanders add special abilities to the mix and are the only thing that actually gets combat experience, and they have multiple branches of perks to choose. It's cool, it works. Graphically, combat animations look nice and the world itself is pretty, though a little hard to read at a glance. I'm sure for people who play with yields on at all times, this won't be a problem. Speaking of yield mode, the map filters are presently pared down a bit. There's only settler, continent, and default. I hope they change the minimap so that landmasses are colored in according to the civ with control over them, but that may even be a bug or simply unimplemented. Or maybe they could add a toggle. I just like seeing the minimap have civ control, so I noticed it. Load times feel decent. Granted, I'm used to playing huge marathon maps, which I did not do here, and I don't think was even an option, but that may also change. I ran it on mid-high graphics, not ultra, and my laptop is about 5 years old with an RTX 2070, if that gives you a sense of scale. It didn't lag out, effects felt pretty crisp, leaders felt more impacted by graphic settings than, say, the map, which is good, given you spend 90% of your time staring at terrain, not the Marquis de Lafayette. Which leads us to leaders and a particular double bind I think the game entered here. They're not as present as Civ 5's leaders, which I really enjoyed with the intro speeches and their respective environments and what have you, but I think this game, more than prior entries, needs something like that to help the leaders feel like characters, because they've been ungrounded from their civs. They effectively don't represent any specific thing anymore and are in turn not reinforced by notions of, for example, what it means to be leader of the Songhai. Now, as for actually dealing with the leaders, these characters as I put it, diplomacy has been reshaped around something called influence points, which are a welcome addition in a game that seems to want to care more about diplomacy than previous entries did. Diplo being a resource means that diplomacy games aren't just econ games in disguise. On the note of start placement bias and resets, I don't really know what causes start bias, if it's leaders or civ picks, but there's potentially some tension there. I tried 2 starts as Axum before I got any coastline, which was unfortunate, but once I got one, an island start no less, something I have a history of resetting 30 times for when the mood strikes, it felt powerful the way a lot of terrain-enabled civs do. Mind you, I wasn't going for an OP start and re-rolling till I got one, I was just hoping to get a start that enabled my civ at all. But also I was playing as Axum Xerxes, which isn't a recommended combo and is why I can't help wondering which thing affects the bias more. I did 1 start as Egypt instead and got a tundra coast with a weak river. Point being, I need more sample size before an actual verdict can be rendered, but it did make me think of that age-old problem of necessary resets that has plagued Civ since at least 5. On the other hand, this tension allows for suboptimal builds, and I mean that in a good way. Nothing stops you from picking Tubman and Egypt and getting those potentially conflicting desert and forest terrain interests and trying to work with them, or indeed find ways to flourish. Cool, now 2 terrain types affect you. Now you can specialize cities around 2 different bonuses. Some leaders have guaranteed evolution paths, so to speak, and it means they'll ascend into a final form, an inevitable conclusion that's more synergistic with the leader. I think it's interesting, at the very least. On the age system and transition, these act as a bit of a functional reset. Your armies are reconstituted, repositioned back home, your cities devolve into towns, and resources are changed in placement, availability, and use. It's like a new round in a sense. Granted, you do keep a lot of benefits from a strong position in the prior era, but there's clearly a focus on trying to stop the endless snowballing of previous games, which could make late game feel more like running through a foregone conclusion for 100 turns rather than an actual game. I feel like undoing that curse, getting people to play full games, was a design emphasis for Civ 7. I'd use the word disorienting to describe the transition. It affects everything from resource function to resource distribution to the impact of religion on your society. But that said, I kinda like it. It models something Civ never could before, the change in resource value. Like, think about how copper was a bonus resource in Civ 6, even though the function of it in society drastically changed from the Bronze Age to the present, what with electronics and computers. Sure, it got a bonus to value late game, but it should have changed to a luxury or strategic resource given the newfound relevance. This new system strikes me as one that's got a lot of potential, but I know it'll be a growing pain for some folks. There's parts of the game that feel unresponsive to clicking that I'd sort of expect to just do something, if that makes sense. For example, in the Civlopedia, you can't click on a Civ's unique unit to switch to that page, and you have to click the city center to open diplomacy with the leader, not the nameplate, which does nothing. The biggest design philosophy change is that Civ 7 is a game about builds, far more than previous games. The customization options lend themselves to creative mixing and optimizations that weren't present before. 6 had policy cards, but that pales in comparison to the mix of leaders, civs, and unique civics. It can be a lot to keep track of, but it feels like a fairly complex toolkit, all things considered. There's also a progression system, which honestly, my first impression of it is that I don't like that kind of thing in a game like this. Having fewer, more unique challenges, giving cosmetic rewards for achievements, that would be cool, but as it stands, it feels like what is supposed to be fun, gradual unlocks has material gameplay benefits, and a lot of the challenges are just reach era as leader, or worse, do it multiple times. If it were just cosmetic, I'd be more fine with it, I think, because they'd just be nice treats instead of gameplay impact. I don't know, maybe it's just not for me, but it's also not a drastic negative departure. Playing a second game was when a lot of it clicked. I understand what the game was going for more and how to build up within an era in ways that endure into the next. I felt more like I knew what I was doing for sure, but more than that, I got what was worth looking out for. Started recognizing what wonders are probably going to be my favorite. I'm still confident that this game will, true to Civ form, be divisive at launch. As someone who is a Civ 5 permafan and has had issues with 6, I'm well aware that this is how it always goes. But the combination of changes in this one feel drastic. Some things in this game feel like obvious scaffolding for a future expansion to address. That's part of the Civ formula at this point, an audience expectation, a familiar part of what it means to be Civ, for better and worse. While I like the game at present, I can't exactly fault someone for walking away with the impression that the element it shares most with previous games at present is that it's leaving room for expansions. Where Civ 5's big changes were unique abilities, the hex grid, and the end of stacking units, and Civ 6's was districts, 7 is going to be marked by a lot of things at once, and I think they might overshadow the elements that pull from the toolkit of previous games. I see a bit of 4 in this one. I see some returns to 5. I see parts of 6 in what they've replaced from 6. And I see a game in communication with the broader genre, trying new things. My prediction is that specialists and dense cities are going to run this game more than before, but I could easily be wrong. It's interesting to get used to this new game, and as I do, it feels better and better. As clear as the tutorial is, and as important as one can be for onboarding players, I don't think it'll address the hurdle that returning players will have, which is the raw newness of the game. And I do mean hurdle, not outright barrier. All in all, my first impression is that the game has a strong framework and a freshness to it. I like the graphic style, but it can be a little hard to read. My main actual concerns are UI interface ones, like the rarity of nested tooltips, segmentedpedia, all that. The things I need changed are ones that probably will change. First impression verdict as of one completed run and having started a second, I earnestly enjoy it and see the vision behind a lot of the changes, and I think it'll grow on me quickly. The next 2 videos are going to be sponsored by 2K, likely first a review, and then a more formal essay on the idea of the Civ formula as expressed by Civ 7. I'm glad I got the opportunity to look at the game early, and I'm excited to share more in-depth thoughts with you all in the coming month or so.